A stranger handed me their phone at the airport and said, "Hold this for 90 seconds. Now 12 men in suits are surrounding me." The woman appeared next to me at gate 47 in Terminal C while I was scrolling through flight delay updates, and everything about her radiated wrong. She wore a charcoal business suit that looked expensive. Her dark hair pulled back so tight it seemed painful, and her eyes had that hollowed-out quality of someone who hadn't slept in days. She held an iPhone in a rose gold case, and her hands were shaking badly enough that I noticed it before she spoke. Her voice came out in a rushed whisper that made my stomach clench with instinctive alarm. "I need you to hold this for 90 seconds. Please, I'm begging you. Just 90 seconds, and then I'll take it back and you'll never see me again. I promise." Before I could process what was happening or form any kind of response, she pressed the phone into my palm with a grip so desperate her nails dug crescents into my skin. Her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that felt like drowning, and I saw real terror there, the kind that bypasses rational thought and triggers every primal survival instinct. Then she turned and walked away with mechanical precision toward the women's restroom, her posture rigid like someone forcing themselves not to run. I stood there, holding this stranger's phone, my brain trying to catch up with a situation that had unfolded in maybe 8 seconds total. The phone was warm from her grip and surprisingly heavy, one of the newer models with the titanium frame. The screen was dark, and I didn't try to wake it because touching someone else's phone felt like a violation, even though she'd literally forced it into my hands. Around me, the gate area was packed with the usual airport chaos. Families sprawled across seats, business travelers typing on laptops, a kid screaming about wanting McDonald's. Nobody had noticed our brief interaction. I glanced at my watch and decided to give it the 90 seconds she'd asked for because I'm apparently the kind of person who honors weird requests from frantic strangers. 68 seconds left. The phone suddenly vibrated in my hand with an incoming call, and I almost dropped it. The screen lit up, showing no caller ID, just the standard green answer button and red decline. The vibration felt aggressive, insistent, like whoever was calling knew exactly where this phone was and was demanding response. I let it go to voicemail. 41 seconds left. That's when I noticed the men. They materialized from different directions like they'd been waiting for a signal, all wearing nearly identical dark suits with the kind of fit that suggested either significant money or institutional uniformity. They moved with coordinated purpose, not running, but walking with that deliberate speed that covers ground quickly without drawing attention. I counted 8 of them converging on my position from various angles, and my hands went cold with a sudden understanding that something very bad was happening. These weren't random travelers. They were coming for the phone I was holding. 23 seconds left. I looked toward the women's restroom where the woman had disappeared, but she hadn't emerged. One of the suited men, maybe 40 with steel gray hair and a face like carved granite, was now 15 feet away and closing. His hand moved to his jacket in a motion I recognized from too many crime shows, and my body made a decision before my brain caught up. I started walking, not running, because running in an airport post 9/11 gets you tackled by actual security, but moving with purpose toward the main terminal corridor, where there would be more people and witnesses and cameras. The suited men adjusted their approach vectors, and I realized with creeping horror that they were hurting me, cutting off certain directions while leaving others open, guiding me away from the crowded gate areas toward the quieter sections of the terminal. My heart hammered against my ribs hard enough to hurt, and I clutched the phone tighter, some instinct telling me that dropping it or abandoning it would solve nothing and might make things worse. 10 seconds left on the 90-second countdown. The phone vibrated again, this time with a text message, and I glanced down at the screen, despite myself. The message preview showed just 3 words: "They'll kill you." I looked up, and there were now 12 men in suits surrounding me in a loose but tightening circle, and the woman from the gate was nowhere to be seen. 0 seconds. I'd held the phone for the full 90 seconds she'd requested, and she hadn't come back, and I was standing in the middle of an airport terminal being slowly surrounded by what looked like either federal agents or private security contractors, and every single one of them was focused on me with the intensity of predators who'd cornered prey. The gray-haired man who seemed to be in charge raised one hand in a gesture that might have been placating or might have been a signal to the others. His voice was smooth and professional and utterly terrifying in its calm reasonableness. "Sir, I'm going to need you to hand over that phone and come with us. There's been a misunderstanding, and we need to sort this out. Everything will be fine if you cooperate." The way he said cooperate made it clear that not cooperating was an option I'd regret. I looked around at the other travelers moving through the terminal, all of them oblivious to what was happening maybe 20 feet away. Airport security was visible near the entrance to the concourse, 2 bored-looking TSA agents checking boarding passes, but they hadn't noticed the situation developing. I was on my own, holding a phone that apparently carried enough significance to warrant a 12-man extraction team. My mouth was dry, and my voice came out shakier than I wanted when I spoke. "Who are you people? What's on this phone? Why did that woman give it to me?" The gray-haired man's expression never changed, but something flickered in his eyes that looked like impatience, or maybe calculation. The woman you're referring to is a person of interest in an ongoing investigation. She transferred sensitive materials to that device with the intention of compromising national security protocols. You're currently in possession of classified information, which makes you liable under federal statutes. We need that phone, and we need you to come answer some questions about your relationship with the subject. His words were carefully chosen, hitting all the right official notes, but something about the delivery felt wrong. Real federal agents would have shown badges by now, would have involved actual airport security, would have followed protocols designed to avoid public incidents. These men were operating in a gray zone, using the appearance of authority without the substance, and that realization sent ice down my spine. I'd seen enough documentaries about black site interrogations and extraordinary rendition to know that some operations existed outside normal legal frameworks, places where constitutional rights became flexible concepts and people disappeared into administrative limbo for months or years. The phone in my hand suddenly felt like a live grenade with an invisible pin already pulled. I made a decision that was probably stupid, but felt like the only option that didn't end with me in an unmarked van heading to a facility that didn't officially exist. I raised the phone above my head where everyone could see it and shouted loudly enough to cut through the terminal ambient noise. This man is threatening me. These men are trying to kidnap me. Someone call airport security, please. I need help. Heads turned throughout the terminal, that universal human response to raised voices and potential conflict. The gray-haired man's professional mask cracked just slightly, a flash of real anger crossing his features, and I saw his hand move again toward his jacket. For a terrible second, I thought he might actually pull a weapon in the middle of a crowded airport. Consequences be damned. But instead, he spoke rapidly into a concealed radio unit, probably calling for backup or new instructions. The crowd that had turned to look was now actively watching, phones coming out to record, and the TSA agents at the checkpoint were finally noticing that something was happening. The suited men held their positions but didn't advance further, clearly calculating whether the public exposure was worth the risk of completing their objective. A woman in her 60s with that particular breed of elderly fearlessness walked right up to the circle and demanded to know what was going on. One of the suited men tried to wave her away, but she planted herself like a tree and announced that she was calling 911 because this looked like exactly the kind of thing the news kept warning about, strangers pretending to be officials and trafficking people. Other travelers were gathering now, that crowd effect where humans instinctively cluster around drama, and I felt a surge of desperate gratitude because whatever was happening, it couldn't happen with this many witnesses. The gray-haired man seemed to reach the same conclusion. He stepped back and spoke in a voice pitched for the crowd, smooth and reassuring and completely false. There's been a misunderstanding. We're with TSA Special Investigations, and we're following up on a security flagging. This gentleman isn't in any trouble. We just need to verify some information. He pulled out a badge that looked official enough at a distance. But I noticed several people in the crowd didn't seem convinced, their phones still recording, their expressions skeptical. That's when actual airport police arrived, 2 uniformed officers responding to the disturbance report that someone in the crowd must have called in. They pushed through the gathered travelers and immediately demanded to know what was happening, and I saw the gray-haired man's jaw tighten with frustration. He explained the situation using that same smooth professional tone, showing his badge, making it all sound reasonable and routine, but the officers looked confused because apparently TSA Special Investigations doesn't usually deploy 12-man teams to gate areas without coordinating with airport security first. One of the officers, a young guy with a nameplate reading Delgado, asked to see the badge more closely, and I watched the gray-haired man's calculations shift in real time. He was weighing whether to maintain the fiction or cut his losses, and I could see the exact moment he decided the exposure had gone too far. He made a subtle hand gesture, and the 12 suited men began withdrawing, not running but moving with coordinated efficiency toward different exits, melting back into the terminal crowd like they'd never been there. Officer Delgado tried to stop them, calling out for them to wait for questioning, but they ignored him with the confidence of people who knew local police couldn't actually detain them, even if they wanted to. The gray-haired man paused before leaving and locked eyes with me across the dissipating crowd. His expression promised that this wasn't over, that walking away now was a tactical retreat rather than a surrender, and that I'd made the situation significantly worse for myself by forcing a public confrontation. Then he was gone, and I was standing in the middle of a terminal with 2 confused airport police officers and a crowd of travelers whose phones had captured the entire bizarre incident. Officer Delgado approached me and asked for my identification and an explanation of what had just happened. I handed over my driver's license with my free hand while still clutching the stranger's phone in the other and tried to explain something I didn't understand myself. A woman gave me this phone and asked me to hold it for 90 seconds. Then those men showed up and tried to take it from me. They said something about classified information and national security. They wouldn't show proper identification, and they were trying to make me leave with them. The officer examined my license and then looked at the phone in my hand with the expression of someone who'd just realized this situation was way above his pay grade. He radioed for his supervisor and asked me to wait while they sorted out jurisdiction and protocols. The crowd was slowly dispersing now that the immediate drama had passed, though several people lingered, still recording on their phones, probably already uploading to social media with captions about suspicious men in airports. I thought about the woman who'd given me the phone, how terrified she'd looked, how she'd specifically asked for 90 seconds like that particular time frame mattered. She'd wanted those men to see me with the phone, I realized. She'd used me as a decoy or a distraction, buying herself time to do something else or get somewhere safe. I'd been a prop in someone else's desperate gambit, and now I was holding the consequences. The phone vibrated again with another incoming call, same no caller ID display, and Officer Delgado immediately told me not to answer it. His hand moved to his radio, like he was preparing to call in specialists, bomb squad maybe, or federal agencies who dealt with situations involving mysterious phones and threatening men in suits. His supervisor arrived within 3 minutes, a woman in her 40s with sergeant stripes and the weathered competence of someone who'd worked airport security through countless weird situations. She introduced herself as Sergeant Valdez and asked me to walk through everything that had happened from the beginning. I explained about the woman at the gate, her desperate request, the 90-second time limit, the phone call and text message, the 12 men appearing and surrounding me. Valdez listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. When I finished, she asked if I would consent to letting them examine the phone, and I agreed immediately because I desperately wanted to pass this problem to someone with actual authority and resources. She pulled on latex gloves before taking the phone from me, handling it like potential evidence or maybe a bomb, and I felt a cascade of relief once it was out of my hands. The physical burden was gone, but the psychological weight remained, that crawling sense that I'd gotten tangled in something dangerous that wouldn't just let me walk away. Valdez tried to access the phone, but encountered a lock screen requiring facial recognition. She asked if I'd attempted to unlock it or access any of its contents, and I told her truthfully that I hadn't, that I'd only held it as requested and seen the incoming call and text notification. She made several calls on her radio using codes I didn't understand, and within minutes more police arrived along with 2 men in different suits who had the unmistakable bearing of actual federal agents. These men showed proper credentials, FBI field office badges that Valdez examined carefully before nodding her acceptance. The lead agent, a black man in his 50s who introduced himself as Special Agent Whitaker, asked me to repeat my statement from the beginning while his partner took notes. I went through it all again, trying to remember every detail about the woman who'd given me the phone, her appearance, her exact words, the direction she'd gone. Agent Whitaker asked if I'd be willing to look at some photographs to identify her, and I agreed, though my stomach churned with apprehension about getting further involved. He pulled up images on a tablet, swiping through faces while watching my reactions. I shook my head at the first several, but then he showed me a photo of a woman in her mid-30s with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and despite the different context and lighting, I recognized those haunted eyes immediately. That's her, I'm certain. Agent Whitaker exchanged a loaded glance with his partner that spoke volumes about how significant this identification was. The woman's name is Dr. Rebecca Sterling. She's a research scientist working on classified defense projects with top-secret clearance. She went missing from a secure facility approximately 6 hours ago, along with multiple devices containing extremely sensitive information. We've been tracking her movements through electronic signatures and surveillance footage, but we lost her signal about 40 minutes ago here in this terminal. I felt my stomach drop as the implications crystallized. This wasn't some random paranoid conspiracy. This was legitimate espionage, or whistleblowing, or some kind of intelligence crisis. And I'd been drafted as an unwitting participant by a desperate scientist who'd apparently stolen classified materials and needed to pass them off before getting caught. Agent Whitaker continued, his tone carefully neutral but his eyes sharp with assessment. Those men who surrounded you aren't federal agents. We believe they're private contractors working for parties who have a significant interest in recovering what Dr. Sterling took. They've been operating outside legal channels, which means they're willing to use methods and take actions that we can't. The fact that they backed off when you created a public scene suggests they're trying to avoid official scrutiny. But that doesn't mean they've given up. You need to understand the seriousness of your position. You've been physically associated with materials that multiple entities consider vital to their interests. Your face is probably in their database now, your identity being researched as we speak. I wanted to scream that I'd just been trying to catch a flight to Seattle for my sister's wedding, that I hadn't asked for any of this, that I was a high school history teacher who lived in a 1-bedroom apartment and had never even gotten a speeding ticket. Instead, I just stood there feeling the walls of my normal, boring, safe life crumbling away like they'd been made of paper all along. Agent Whitaker must have seen the panic building in my expression because his voice softened slightly, taking on a tone that might have been genuine sympathy or might have been practiced manipulation. I know this isn't your fault. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Dr. Sterling used you without your consent. But we need your full cooperation to resolve this situation safely. That means answering all our questions completely and honestly. And it means following security protocols until we can determine the scope of the exposure. I asked what that meant specifically, and his answer made my blood run cold. It means you're not getting on your flight to Seattle. It means we need you to come to our field office for a comprehensive debriefing. It means your movements and communications will be monitored until we've secured the situation and eliminated any threat vectors. He said it all like it was routine procedure, but what I heard was, your life is no longer your own, your plans are canceled, your freedom is suspended, and you have no choice in any of it because we have the authority and you don't. I thought about my sister Rebecca getting married tomorrow afternoon, how I was supposed to be there early to help with last-minute setup, how she'd been planning this wedding for 18 months, and I'd promised her I wouldn't miss it for anything. I thought about telling her I couldn't come because I'd accidentally gotten involved in an espionage situation at the airport, how insane that would sound, how hurt and angry she'd be. I thought about my principal expecting me back at school on Monday, my students waiting for their test results, my cat Jasper alone in my apartment with an automatic feeder that only had 2 days' worth of food, all the normal details of a normal life that suddenly felt impossibly distant and fragile. Agent Whitaker was watching me process these thoughts, and when I didn't protest or argue, he nodded like I'd passed some kind of test. Good. We appreciate your cooperation. An agent will escort you to our field office where we'll conduct a formal interview and assess the situation. In the meantime, I need you to surrender your phone, your laptop if you have one, and any other electronic devices. This is standard protocol for security incidents involving classified materials. I handed over my phone and the small tablet I'd been using to read on the flight. Agent Whitaker's partner, a younger woman with auburn hair and calculating eyes, bagged them as evidence and logged them with a case number. She asked if I had any weapons or anything else they should know about, and I almost laughed at the absurdity, because the most dangerous thing I typically carried was red grading pens. They escorted me through the terminal toward the airport exit, flanked by uniformed police officers who kept other travelers at a distance. People stared as we passed, probably wondering what I'd done, whether I was a terrorist or a criminal or just another poor bastard caught in the security apparatus. We exited through a side door reserved for official use and approached a dark sedan with government plates. The younger agent opened the rear door and gestured for me to get in, and I hesitated for just a moment, some part of my brain screaming that getting into unmarked vehicles with strangers was exactly what I'd been afraid those suited men would force me to do. But these were real FBI agents with real credentials and real legal authority, and refusing to cooperate would only make everything worse. I climbed into the back seat. The drive to the FBI field office took 23 minutes through afternoon traffic, and nobody spoke during the trip. I stared out the window watching the familiar streets of my city pass by and wondering how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong so quickly. This morning I'd woken up excited about my sister's wedding, about seeing family I hadn't visited in months, about taking a few days off from the relentless grind of teaching. I'd packed carefully, double-checked my flight time, arrived at the airport with plenty of buffer time because I hate rushing. I'd done everything right, followed all the rules, been a responsible and prepared traveler. And then a terrified scientist had pressed her phone into my hands, and my entire life had derailed in 90 seconds. The field office was a bland concrete building in an industrial area, the kind of architecture that screamed government facility, with its total absence of personality or aesthetic consideration. We parked in an underground garage and took an elevator up to the 3rd floor, walking through corridors with fluorescent lighting and cheap industrial carpet. Agent Whitaker led me to an interview room that looked exactly like every police interrogation room I'd seen in movies: metal table, uncomfortable chairs, mirror that was obviously one-way glass, camera mounted in the corner. He gestured for me to sit and asked if I wanted coffee or water. I requested water mostly because my mouth felt like I'd swallowed sand, and the younger agent left to get it while Whitaker settled into the chair across from me. He placed a digital recorder on the table and formally identified himself, the date, the time, and my name for the record. Then he began asking questions in a methodical pattern that covered every detail of my day from when I'd woken up through the incident at the airport. Where did you go before arriving at the terminal? Did you notice anyone following you or paying unusual attention to you? Had you ever seen Dr. Sterling before today? Do you have any connection to defense research or classified programs? Have you traveled internationally in the past 6 months? The boy questions went on for nearly 2 hours, circling back to cover the same ground from different angles, probing for inconsistencies or hidden details. I answered everything as completely and honestly as I could, but I could feel exhaustion creeping in, that mental fatigue that comes from extended stress and hypervigilance. Eventually, Agent Whitaker leaned back and studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Your story is consistent, and we don't have any evidence suggesting prior connection to Dr. Sterling or her work. Preliminary assessment is that you were an opportunistic choice, selected at random because you were available and looked trustworthy. That's good news for you because it means you're not a suspect in the theft itself. Bad news is that you've still been exposed to a situation involving multiple hostile actors, and we can't guarantee your safety until we've resolved the larger investigation. I asked the question that had been building in my throat for hours. What exactly did she steal? What's on that phone that's worth all of this? Whitaker was quiet for a long moment, clearly debating how much to tell me, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of information he wasn't supposed to share. Dr. Sterling was part of a research team developing next-generation satellite reconnaissance technology with applications for both defense and intelligence operations. The materials she took include technical specifications, source code, and documentation that would allow anyone with sufficient resources to either replicate the technology or develop countermeasures against it. In the wrong hands, this information could compromise billions of dollars in defense investment and potentially endanger lives by rendering certain surveillance capabilities obsolete. Several foreign intelligence services would pay enormous sums for what's on that phone, and several domestic corporations would kill to have it for their own competitive purposes. The private contractors who tried to take you at the airport likely represent one of those corporate interests, probably hired by a defense company that stands to lose a government contract if this technology becomes compromised. My head spun trying to process the scale of what I'd stumbled into. The layers of money and power and violence that apparently swirled around defense technology. I'd taught units on the Cold War and the military-industrial complex, helped students understand the abstract concepts of espionage and technological competition between nations, but actually sitting in the center of one of these situations felt nothing like the sanitized version we discussed in classrooms. It felt chaotic and terrifying and deeply unjust, like I'd been pulled into a machine designed to chew up ordinary people as collateral damage in conflicts they never consented to join. I asked when I could leave, when I could call my sister and explain why I'd missed her wedding, when I could go home and try to salvage what was left of my normal life. Agent Whitaker's expression shifted to something that might have been regret, or might have been pity. That's complicated. We need to keep you in protective custody until we've neutralized the threat from the private contractors. They saw your face, they know you had physical contact with the phone, and they don't know that you don't have copies of the data, or that Dr. Sterling didn't tell you something significant. From their perspective, you're a loose end that needs to be tied off, and these people don't leave loose ends walking around. I felt rage building in my chest, hot and choking. You're telling me I'm a prisoner. I didn't do anything wrong. I cooperated with everything you asked. I gave you the phone. I answered all your questions. And now you're saying I can't leave because some corporate mercenaries might come after me? That's insane. This is America. You can't just detain people indefinitely without charges. Whitaker's expression hardened, losing the sympathetic edge he'd been projecting. This is a national security situation involving classified materials. We have broad authority under federal statutes to detain material witnesses and protect them from threats. You're not under arrest, but you are in protective custody, which means you'll be housed in a secure facility until the threat is neutralized. That could be days or weeks, depending on how the investigation develops. You'll be provided with food, accommodations, and the ability to communicate with family members under supervision. I know this isn't what you want to hear, but it's for your own safety and the safety of the investigation. The careful phrasing told me everything I needed to know about how little choice I actually had. They were dressing up detention as protection, using security justifications to bypass inconvenient rights and procedures. I thought about demanding a lawyer, asserting my constitutional protections, making a scene about due process and illegal detention. But I was alone in a federal building surrounded by armed agents who had the full authority of the United States government behind them. And I was a high school teacher who couldn't afford a lawyer who'd know how to fight this kind of case. Power had spoken, and I had no meaningful way to answer back. They moved me to what they called a secure residence, which turned out to be a safe house in a suburban neighborhood about 40 minutes from the city. It was a bland ranch-style home with bars on the windows hidden behind decorative shutters and a security system that would make a bank envious. 2 agents stayed with me around the clock in rotating shifts, monitoring my movements and communications. They let me call my sister from a monitored phone, and I had to explain through tears that I couldn't make her wedding because of a situation I couldn't discuss, that I was safe but couldn't travel, that I was so sorry and I loved her. She cried and hung up, angry, and I didn't blame her. I'd broken a promise that mattered more than almost anything, and I had no way to make her understand that I hadn't had a choice. The agents monitoring the call assured me this was temporary, that I'd be able to explain everything once the situation was resolved, but their reassurances felt hollow against the sound of my sister's heartbreak. Days blurred together in the safe house. I slept on a government-issue bed in a room with no personal effects. I ate food brought in by agents who wouldn't engage in real conversation. I watched television news coverage that mentioned a scientist from a defense contractor who'd gone missing but gave no details about what she'd taken or why. There was no mention of an incident at the airport or a civilian caught in the middle. My story had been edited out of the narrative entirely, which somehow made the whole situation feel even more unreal and isolating. On the 4th day, Agent Whitaker visited and told me there had been developments in the case. Dr. Sterling had been located in Montreal, attempting to board a flight to Brussels. She'd been arrested by Canadian authorities and was being extradited back to the United States to face charges of espionage and theft of classified materials. The phone I'd held for 90 seconds had been fully analyzed, and the data it contained was even more sensitive than initially believed. The good news, Whitaker said, was that the private contractors had backed off once they confirmed the materials were in FBI custody. The bad news was that the investigation had expanded to include multiple suspects, and I might need to testify at trial. I asked when I could go home, and Whitaker's pause before answering told me everything. The threat assessment still shows elevated risk. We've identified communications suggesting that certain parties believe you might have accessed the data on the phone or that Dr. Sterling might have shared information with you verbally. Until we can definitively prove to all interested parties that you have no intelligence value, we recommend maintaining protective custody. I exploded, all the rage and frustration I'd been suppressing for days erupting at once. This is bullshit. You're ruining my life because of what someone might think I might know about something I never wanted to be involved with in the first place. I've lost my job by now because I can't even call my principal to explain. My apartment is probably trashed because I haven't been able to pay rent or take care of my cat. My sister thinks I abandoned her on her wedding day. And you're telling me I need to stay in custody indefinitely because you can't convince some corporate criminals that I'm not a threat? How is any of this legal or just a right? Whitaker let me finish and then responded with the practiced calm of someone who dealt with this anger before. I understand your frustration, and I genuinely sympathize with your position, but the law recognizes that national security concerns can temporarily supersede certain individual rights when properly authorized. We've followed all required protocols and obtained the necessary approvals for your protective custody. If you want to challenge this legally, you have the right to request a judicial review. But I should warn you that such reviews typically favor government security determinations unless there's clear evidence of abuse. Your best option is to continue cooperating and let us work to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. The subtext was clear. Fight this, and you'll lose, waste time and money and emotional energy on a battle you can't win, or accept the situation and hope we eventually decide to let you go. It was a choice between different flavors of powerlessness, and I hated every option with a fury that made my hands shake. That night, I lay awake in the safe house bedroom listening to the agents talking quietly in the living room, and I thought about all the ways systems fail people, how institutions designed to protect can become instruments of control, how authority unchecked becomes indistinguishable from tyranny. On the 8th day of my detention, something changed. I woke to the sound of urgent radio chatter and agents moving through the house with heightened alertness. They wouldn't tell me what was happening, just ordered me to stay in my room and away from windows. I heard vehicles outside, multiple engines, and then voices I didn't recognize. An hour later, Agent Whitaker entered my room looking tired and grim. Dr. Sterling escaped custody last night during a transfer between facilities. She killed one guard and critically injured another. She's currently at large with unknown resources and unknown intentions. We've obtained intelligence suggesting she might try to contact you because you're the only civilian she had direct interaction with during her initial escape. This facility's location may have been compromised, so we're moving you to a more secure location. The fear in his voice was genuine, which made my own terror spike to new heights. If the FBI was scared, then the situation had deteriorated beyond anything I'd understood. They bundled me into an armored SUV and drove for hours to a facility I later learned was a federal detention center normally used for high-value witnesses in organized crime cases. This wasn't a safe house anymore. This was a prison. They put me in a cell with concrete walls and a metal door with a small window. A guard checked on me every hour. I had no phone, no internet, no connection to the outside world beyond the agents who occasionally updated me on the search for Dr. Sterling. Days became weeks. I lost track of time in the windowless cell, measuring passage only by meal deliveries and shift changes. My sister stopped accepting my monitored calls. My school confirmed they'd terminated my employment for abandonment of position. My landlord had my apartment cleared and my possessions put in storage. My entire life was being dismantled piece by piece while I sat in a cell because a stranger had handed me her phone at an airport and I'd been decent enough to hold it for 90 seconds like she'd asked. The injustice of it consumed me, eroding my sense of self and purpose, until all that remained was anger and the growing certainty that the systems meant to protect citizens were actually designed to protect power. And when those two objectives conflicted, citizens lost every single time. On day 37, Agent Whitaker visited my cell with news that made my stomach drop. We found Dr. Sterling. She's dead. Apparent suicide in a hotel room in Toronto. She left behind a detailed confession admitting that she acted alone, that she never shared the classified information with anyone, and that you had no knowledge of her activities or intentions. This should resolve the threat assessment concerns. I stared at him trying to process emotions too complicated to name. A woman I'd met for 8 seconds was dead. The nightmare that had consumed my life for over a month was apparently over. But nothing felt like victory or resolution, just exhaustion and damage and a fundamental betrayal of trust in institutions I'd been raised to believe were basically just. Whitaker explained that I'd be released within 24 hours after final processing, that the government would provide compensation for my time in protective custody and assistance with rebuilding my life. The amount he mentioned was significant, enough to replace what I'd lost, and then some, but it felt like hush money, payment to keep quiet about how badly they'd failed to protect an innocent person caught in their operation. They released me on a gray morning with rain threatening. I stood outside the detention center holding a packet of documents, including my compensation agreement, and a thick stack of non-disclosure agreements I'd been required to sign. An agent drove me back to my city and dropped me at a hotel because I no longer had an apartment. I sat in the hotel room staring at walls and trying to figure out how to start rebuilding a life that had been shattered by 90 seconds of unwitting involvement in something I still barely understood. The compensation money sat in a new bank account, and it felt contaminated. Blood money paid by systems that had crushed me and wanted to buy my silence about it. I thought about Dr. Rebecca Sterling, about what desperation or conviction or fear had driven her to steal classified materials and then use a random stranger as a human shield. I thought about whether she'd planned to kill herself all along, or whether the pressure of being hunted had pushed her to that final decision. I thought about the guard she'd killed and the one she'd injured, innocent people doing their jobs who'd gotten caught in the blast radius of her choices. 3 months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop trying to grade papers for the online tutoring service I'd joined because no school would hire someone with my employment history. A man in his 60s approached my table and asked if he could sit. Something about his bearing reminded me of Agent Whitaker, that careful authority that came from years in law enforcement or intelligence work. He introduced himself as Thomas Sterling, Dr. Rebecca Sterling's father. He'd tracked me down through connections I didn't understand and couldn't have prevented. His eyes were haunted in a way that matched his daughter's that day at the airport, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of grief that hadn't found any resolution. My daughter was murdered. The government calls it suicide, but I know my Rebecca. She wouldn't have done that. She was fighting for something, trying to expose something about the satellite program she was working on. Corruption, I think, or illegal activity, something that went beyond just corporate competition. She was a whistleblower, not a spy, and they killed her for it and made it look self-inflicted. He pulled out a laptop and showed me encrypted files he'd received from his daughter's lawyer after her death, materials she'd arranged to be released if anything happened to her. The files detailed a pattern of falsified test data and safety violations in the satellite reconnaissance program, evidence that the defense contractor had been billing the government for capabilities the technology couldn't actually deliver. The implications were staggering. Billions in fraudulent charges, satellite systems deployed with fatal flaws, intelligence operations relying on data that might be fundamentally unreliable. His daughter hadn't stolen the technology to sell it. She'd taken evidence of fraud and tried to get it to journalists or oversight authorities before the contractor could bury it. The phone she'd pressed into my hands hadn't contained weapon secrets. It had contained proof of systemic corruption, and the men in suits who'd tried to take me at the airport hadn't been protecting national security. They'd been protecting corporate profits and executive careers. Thomas Sterling looked at me with desperate intensity. I need your help. You were there. You can testify about what happened at the airport, about the private contractors trying to grab you, about how the FBI treated you afterward. You can help me prove this was all a cover-up, that my daughter was telling the truth, that she died trying to expose a fraud that's still ongoing. I sat there feeling the weight of another choice I didn't want to make, another situation where doing the right thing would cost me everything I'd worked to rebuild over the past 3 months. The non-disclosure agreements I'd signed were clear about penalties for revealing classified information or details of the investigation. Speaking out would mean lawsuits, possibly criminal charges, definitely the loss of the compensation money and any chance at rebuilding my teaching career. But staying silent meant letting Rebecca Sterling's death be meaningless, letting the fraud continue, letting the systems that had crushed us both maintain their power through violence and intimidation. I thought about all the students I'd taught about civil disobedience and moral courage, about standing up to unjust authority even when it costs everything. I thought about how hollow those lessons felt, now that I understood the real price of defiance. Thomas Sterling watched me process these thoughts, and I saw him recognize the calculation I was making, the way ordinary people weigh extraordinary costs against abstract principles. When I finally spoke, my voice was steadier than I expected. I'll help you. Not because I'm brave or because I think we'll win. I'll help because your daughter tried to do the right thing and it got her killed, and someone needs to say out loud that what happened to both of us was wrong. The system failed. The people who were supposed to protect us became the threat, and if nobody speaks up about that, then every lesson I ever taught about justice and democracy and standing up to corruption was a lie. So yes, I'll testify. I'll break the non-disclosure agreements. I'll tell the truth about what happened at that airport and what happened afterward. And when they come after me for it, at least I'll know I finally made a choice that mattered. Thomas Sterling's eyes filled with tears, and he gripped my hand across the table with desperate gratitude. Together we started making calls to investigative journalists and congressional oversight committees, began assembling the evidence that would eventually expose one of the largest defense contractor frauds in recent history. The fallout took years. Indictments, trials, a company bankruptcy, reforms that changed how defense contracts were awarded and audited. But that came later. The ending I remember happened 6 months after that coffee shop conversation, standing outside a federal courthouse after giving testimony that had destroyed any chance I had at a quiet, normal life. Thomas Sterling stood beside me, and we watched the news cameras record the contractor executives being led away in handcuffs. He turned to me with an expression of complicated emotion, grief and satisfaction and exhaustion, mixed together in a way that defied easy categorization. His voice was quiet when he spoke. My daughter would have been grateful to know you held her phone for 90 seconds. Those 90 seconds changed everything. They exposed her truth, destroyed the corruption she died fighting, and maybe saved lives by stopping technology built on lies from being deployed. I wanted to feel victorious, but all I felt was tired and scarred and fundamentally changed. If this one kept you hooked, the next ones will too. Make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and stay tuned for more.